The morning of July 5, 1943, above the Kursk salient, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler tightened his grip on the control stick of his Focke-Wulf 190 as he scanned the sky at 20,000 feet. Below him, the largest tank battle in history was unfolding across the rolling Russian steppe. Above him, something impossible was happening. Through the haze of smoke and summer heat, Stigler watched a formation of Soviet fighters climbing toward his altitude. The silhouettes were unmistakable: Lavochkin La-5 fighters, stubby single-engine aircraft that German intelligence had classified as low-altitude ground attack planes. They had no business being up here, not at this altitude, not at this speed. Yet here they were, climbing past 18,000 feet, past 19,000, maintaining formation, engines roaring with power that shouldn't exist. Stigler had been flying combat missions since 1941. He had 28 confirmed victories. He knew Soviet aircraft intimately, had studied their performance characteristics, their limitations, their vulnerabilities. The La-5 was a capable aircraft at low altitude, dangerous below 10,000 feet where its air-cooled radial engine performed well. But above 15,000 feet, it should be struggling. The thin air should be choking its engine, reducing power, limiting performance. The Soviet fighters climbing toward him were doing none of those things. They were accelerating, closing the distance, maintaining formation discipline that suggested experienced pilots flying aircraft, performing far beyond their documented capabilities. For the first time in 2 years of combat over Russia, Stigler felt a tremor of uncertainty. Something had changed. The rules he had learned, the advantages he had counted on, were no longer reliable. What happened in the next 20 minutes would shatter every assumption the Luftwaffe held about Soviet aviation capabilities. The La-5 fighters would demonstrate performance that German engineers had calculated was impossible. They would catch Focke-Wulf 190s at altitudes where the German fighters should have been untouchable, and they would force German pilots to confront a terrifying new reality. The technological gap that had guaranteed German air superiority was closing faster than anyone in the Reich had imagined possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The foundation of German confidence in the summer of 1943 rested on 2 years of aerial dominance over the Eastern Front. Since Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, Luftwaffe pilots had established overwhelming superiority over Soviet aviation. The reasons seemed obvious. German aircraft were superior, German pilots were better trained, and German tactics were more sophisticated. The term Focke-Wulf 190, introduced to combat in 1941, had quickly established itself as one of the finest fighter aircraft in the world. Powered by the BMW 801 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, the FW-190 could reach speeds of 408 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Its service ceiling was 37,000 feet. Its rate of roll exceeded any Allied fighter. The aircraft was rugged, heavily armed, and capable of absorbing tremendous battle damage. German pilots called it the Würger, the butcher bird, a name that reflected both affection and respect for the aircraft's lethal capabilities. Major Erich Rudefer, who would eventually achieve 222 aerial victories, flew the FW-190 extensively on the Eastern Front. He later described it as the finest fighter aircraft he ever flew, better balanced than the Messerschmitt 109. More versatile, more survivable. The tactical advantage the FW-190 provided was particularly pronounced at medium to high altitudes. Between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, the aircraft's supercharged BMW engine maintained excellent power output. German pilots could choose when and where to engage Soviet aircraft. They could climb above Soviet formations, dive through them at high speed, fire accurately with the aircraft's excellent gun platform, then zoom back to altitude before the Soviets could respond. This tactical flexibility, combined with superior training and experience, had allowed German pilots to achieve kill ratios that seemed almost fantastical. On the Eastern Front, it was not uncommon for a single German fighter squadron to claim 20 or 30 Soviet aircraft destroyed in a single day's operations while losing none of their own. The Soviet aircraft opposing them seemed hopelessly outmatched. The Polikarpov I-16, still in service in 1941 despite being obsolete, was a stubby biplane-inspired design that could barely exceed 300 miles per hour. The Yakovlev Yak-1, though more modern, suffered from quality control problems in production. Engines failed, structures broke apart, and performance varied wildly from one aircraft to another. The Lavochkin Lagiga III, introduced in 1941, was so heavy and underpowered that Soviet pilots nicknamed it the Varnished Guaranteed Coffin, a grim play on the acronym formed by its designers' names, Lavochkin, Gorbanov, and Gudkov. The wooden construction absorbed moisture, adding weight. The inline engine was prone to overheating. Performance was marginal at sea level and deteriorated rapidly with altitude. German pilots quickly learned to exploit these weaknesses. They would climb above Soviet formations, position themselves between the enemy and the sun, then dive through the formation in coordinated attacks. Soviet aircraft, unable to climb to German altitudes and lacking the speed to escape, were slaughtered by the thousands. Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, who commanded German fighter forces, received reports from the Eastern Front that seemed to confirm perpetual German superiority. In July 1941, the first month of Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe claimed over 4,000 Soviet aircraft destroyed, many on the ground, but thousands more in aerial combat. In August, another 2,000. By December 1941, Soviet aviation appeared to be on the verge of complete collapse. The statistics supported German confidence. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Marseille achieved 158 victories before his death in September 1942. Major Gunther Roll would eventually achieve 275 victories, most against Soviet aircraft. Major Gerhard Barkhorn would claim 301 victories, again predominantly on the Eastern Front. These numbers, while later scrutinized by historians who note that wartime claims often exceeded actual losses, nevertheless reflected real German tactical and technological superiority. But the German confidence contained a fatal flaw. It was built on the assumption that Soviet aviation would remain static, that the poorly built aircraft and inadequately trained pilots of 1941 would represent the permanent state of the enemy. This assumption ignored Soviet industrial capacity, determination, and willingness to learn from catastrophic defeat. The wake-up call began in late 1942 with isolated reports that filtered back to Luftwaffe intelligence offices. Soviet fighters were appearing at altitudes previously considered safe for German aircraft. Engagements that should have been one-sided German victories were becoming costly fights. Aircraft that intelligence had classified as ground attack planes were engaging in air-to-air combat at medium altitudes and winning. The reports were dismissed initially. Combat, stress, pilot, error, exaggeration. The fundamental assumptions about Soviet inferiority were too deeply entrenched to be questioned based on scattered reports from overworked pilots flying exhausting missions over an endless front. But the reports continued. In January 1943, a group of FW-190s engaged Soviet fighters at 18,000 feet near Rostov. The Germans expected easy victories. Instead, they found themselves in a turning fight against aircraft that matched their performance. 2 German fighters were lost. The Soviet aircraft, according to pilot reports, were La-5 fighters displaying capabilities that exceeded their documented specifications. In March 1943, a reconnaissance FW-190 was intercepted at 22,000 feet by a Soviet fighter that climbed to meet it, engaged in a brief combat, and forced the German pilot to dive away to escape. The German pilot, an experienced officer with 31 victories, reported that the XD-8 Soviet aircraft had been an La-5 and that it had demonstrated climb rate and speed impossible for that aircraft type at that altitude. German intelligence analysts examined these reports and concluded that the pilots were mistaken about aircraft identification. Perhaps they had encountered Yak-9s, or perhaps captured American or British aircraft. The alternative, that the Soviets had dramatically improved the La-5's high-altitude performance seemed impossible. Soviet aviation had never demonstrated the engineering sophistication required for such improvements. The analysts were wrong. The Soviets had not only improved the La-5 but had done so through methodical engineering work that addressed every weakness in the original design. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that the Soviet aviation industry, despite catastrophic losses in 1941 and 42, had been learning, adapting, and innovating with desperate intensity. The Lavochkin La-5 that appeared in 1942 was a complete redesign of the failed La-GG3. Designer Semyon Lavochkin had replaced the inline engine with an air-cooled Shvetsov Aish-82 radial engine, the same engine used in Soviet bombers. The change transformed the aircraft. Weight decreased. Cooling problems disappeared. Reliability improved dramatically. Most importantly, performance increased across the entire flight envelope. The early La-5, designated La-5 Series 1, could reach 342 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Its climb rate was 2,953 feet per minute. Service ceiling was 31,500 feet. These specifications, while respectable, still left the aircraft inferior to the FW-190 at medium and high altitudes. But Lavochkin and his team were not finished. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, they worked on improving the aircraft's high-altitude performance. The focus was the engine. The Aish-82 radial engine, while reliable and powerful at low altitudes, lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. The problem was the supercharger, a mechanically driven compressor that forced more air into the engine at altitude, compensating for the thinner atmosphere. Soviet engineers redesigned the supercharger system, increasing compression ratios, improving airflow, enhancing cooling. They tested new fuel injection systems that maintained consistent fuel-air mixtures at altitude. They experimented with different propeller designs to maximize efficiency in thin air. The work was methodical, scientific, and driven by combat necessity. By early 1943, modified La-5 fighters with improved engines began arriving at frontline units. These aircraft, designated La-5F for forsirovany, meaning boosted, carried engines producing substantially more power at altitude than the original design. The Aish-82F engine maintained higher power output up to 23,000 feet, giving the La-5F performance capabilities that matched or exceeded the FW-190 at medium altitudes. The modifications went beyond the engine. Soviet engineers improved the aircraft's aerodynamics, reducing drag through better cowling design and smoother surface finish. They strengthened the airframe to handle higher speeds and more aggressive maneuvering. They improved the cockpit layout, giving pilots better visibility and more intuitive control placement. Quality control in manufacturing improved as factories gained experience and standardized processes. The result was an aircraft that looked similar to the original La-5, but performed like a completely different machine. The La-5F could reach 389 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, only 19 miles per hour slower than the FW-190 at the same altitude. Its climb rate improved to 3,600 feet per minute. Service ceiling increased to 35,000 feet. Most importantly, the aircraft maintained good handling characteristics and combat effectiveness at altitudes where the original La-5 had been nearly helpless. German intelligence knew none of this. Their last comprehensive evaluation of the La-5 had been based on examinations of early production aircraft and pilot reports from 1942. Those evaluations concluded that the La-5 was a capable low-altitude fighter, but inferior above 15,000 feet. German tactical doctrine, training materials, and mission planning all reflected this assessment. German pilots preparing for missions over Kursk in July 1943 were briefed that they would face primarily Yak-1 and Yak-9 fighters at medium altitudes, with La-5 fighters restricted to low-altitude ground attack and air defense roles. They were told that above 15,000 feet, they would have complete performance superiority over any Soviet aircraft they encountered. They were told wrong. The Battle of Kursk, Operation Citadel in German planning documents, was intended to be the decisive blow that would restore German initiative on the Eastern Front. The plan called for converging armoured thrusts from north and south to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. Air power would play a crucial role, providing close air support for ground forces and maintaining air superiority over the battlefield. The Luftwaffe committed substantial forces to the operation. The 4th Air Fleet in the south and 6th Air Fleet in the north together fielded approximately 2,000 aircraft, including over 300 FW-190s and Messerschmitt 109s dedicated to air superiority missions. German pilots were confident. They had numerical advantage, superior aircraft, better training, and 2 years of victory behind them. The Soviet response surprised them. Soviet aviation committed over 2,500 aircraft to defending the Kursk salient, including newly equipped fighter regiments flying the latest La-5F models. Soviet commanders, learning from 2 years of defeat, had developed new tactics specifically designed to counter German altitude advantages. They positioned fighters at multiple altitudes, used ground control to vector fighters to intercepts, and emphasized coordinated attacks rather than individual duels. On July 5, 1943, the first day of the German offensive, the air battle began at dawn. German fighters swept ahead of the ground forces, clearing the sky of Soviet aircraft, or so they attempted. What they encountered instead was organized resistance from aircraft performing at levels German intelligence had said were impossible. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, leading a swarm of 4 FW-190s on a fighter sweep at 20,000 feet, first encountered the new Soviet capabilities at 08:45 hours. His formation was flying northwest of Belgorod, clearing a path for German bomber formations that would attack Soviet artillery positions. The sky was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for spotting enemy aircraft at long range. Stigler's wingman called out contacts at 10 o'clock low, approximately 8 Soviet fighters climbing from 15,000 feet. Stigler identified them as La-5s and assessed the tactical situation according to standard doctrine. The Soviet fighters were below him, climbing, at a disadvantage in every respect. He would dive through their formation, destroy 1 or 2, then zoom back to altitude before the survivors could react. It was a tactic that had worked hundreds of times before. Stigler rolled into his attack, diving at 45 degrees, building speed rapidly. His airspeed indicator climbed past 350 miles per hour, past 400. The La-5s grew larger in his gun sight. He selected the leader, centered the target, prepared to fire. At 1,200 feet range, the Soviet formation broke. Not a panicked scatter, but a coordinated defensive split, 4 aircraft breaking left, 4 breaking right, executed with precision that suggested well-trained pilots rather than the inexperienced replacements German intelligence had promised. Stigler followed the left group, maintaining his dive, closing the range. At 800 feet, he fired a 2-second burst from his 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. Shells tracked toward the lead Soviet fighter, but the pilot threw his aircraft into a violent roll, evading. Stigler's speed carried him past and below the Soviet formation. He pulled back on the control stick, trading speed for altitude, preparing to zoom back above the enemy for another attack. That's when everything changed. The La-5s didn't attempt to follow his dive. Instead, they climbed. Not a laboring, struggling climb, but a sustained, powerful ascent that matched Stigler's zoom climb almost exactly. The Soviet fighters stayed with him, maintaining position, threatening to convert his escape maneuver into their attack opportunity. Stigler's airspeed bled off as he climbed. 320 miles per hour, 300, 280. He rolled level at 21,000 feet, expecting to have altitude advantage over the Soviet fighters. Instead, he found them at his altitude, slightly behind him, positioning for an attack. For the first time in his combat career, Stigler felt genuine tactical alarm. This was impossible. La-5s couldn't climb like that, couldn't maintain power at this altitude, shouldn't be able to match an FW-190's zoom climb. Every briefing, every intelligence report, every tactical assessment said so. His wingman's voice cut through the radio. "Leader, they're closing. 3 o'clock high." Stigler looked right and saw two La-5s diving toward his formation from 23,000 feet. He hadn't seen them climb there. The Soviet fighters had achieved altitude superiority without him noticing. Everything in his tactical training said this situation shouldn't exist. Stigler called for his formation to break right. The 4 FW-190s turned hard, pulling 5 Gs, fighting to bring their noses around to engage the attacking Soviet fighters. The La-5s followed the turn, maintaining position, demonstrating turn rates that matched the German fighters. This was deeply wrong. The FW-190's excellent roll rate should have allowed Stigler's formation to reverse direction and gain advantage. The Soviet fighters were matching them through the entire maneuver. The engagement dissolved into a turning fight, both formations circling at 20,000 feet, each seeking advantage, neither finding it. Stigler found himself in a fundamentally different kind of combat than he had experienced in 2 years on the Eastern Front. These Soviet pilots weren't making the expected mistakes. They weren't panicking, weren't breaking formation, weren't providing easy shots. They flew with discipline and coordination that matched German standards. More alarming, their aircraft performed with capabilities that contradicted every intelligence assessment. The La-5s maintained power at altitude, turned with the FW-190s, sustained high-G maneuvers without stalling. After 3 minutes of combat, Stigler made the tactical decision that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. He disengaged, rolled his formation out of the turn, pushed the throttle forward, and dove away to the west at full power. Not because he was losing, but because he couldn't win. He couldn't establish the altitude and speed advantages that his tactics required. The Soviet fighters matched his performance across the entire flight envelope. His swarm returned to base without losses, but also without victories. In the debriefing, Stigler reported his encounter to the intelligence officer with precise technical detail. The La-5s had climbed to 23,000 feet. They had sustained combat at 20 to 21,000 feet. They had matched FW-190 turn rates. They had demonstrated climb performance equal to German fighters. Their engines had not shown any signs of power loss at altitude. The intelligence officer listened, took notes, and then asked the standard question: "Are you certain these were La-5 aircraft and not Yak-9s or perhaps captured British fighters?" Stigler's response was sharp. "I've been fighting over Russia for 2 years. I know what a La-5 looks like. These were La-5s, but they performed like completely different aircraft from what we encountered 6 months ago." Similar reports came from other units throughout that first day of the Kursk offensive. FW-190 pilots reported engagements at medium and high altitudes against La-5 fighters that demonstrated unexpected performance. Several German fighters were damaged or shot down in combats where they should have had overwhelming advantage. By the evening of July 5th, the pattern was undeniable. Something fundamental had changed in the air war over Russia. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German intelligence worked through the night of July 5th, analyzing combat reports, examining gun camera footage, and attempting to understand what they were seeing. The evidence was consistent across multiple units and multiple engagements. La-5 fighters were operating effectively at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet. They were engaging FW-190s and Messerschmitt 109s in combat and not being easily defeated. Most troubling, they were doing this in significant numbers, suggesting widespread deployment rather than a handful of special aircraft. Major Gunther Rohl, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces with over 100 victories at that point in the war, flew a mission on July 6th that confirmed the new reality. Leading a group of 12 FW-190s on a fighter sweep at 19,000 feet, Rohl encountered a formation of approximately 16 La-5 fighters at similar altitude northeast of Kursk. The Soviet formation was flying a tight defensive circle, a tactic designed to provide mutual support and prevent diving attacks. Roll evaluated the tactical situation and made his approach according to standard doctrine. He would position his formation above the Soviet circle, dive through it at high speed, destroy vulnerable aircraft, then zoom back to altitude before the defenders could respond. It was textbook fighter tactics against an inferior enemy. Roll led his group up to 23,000 feet, positioned himself up-sun from the Soviet formation, and rolled into his attack. As the German fighters dove, the Soviet circle broke into coordinated elements. 4 La-5s climbed to meet the attack. Another 4 broke away from the circle and climbed separately, positioning for a counterattack. The remaining 8 maintained their defensive formation. The tactical sophistication impressed Roll, even as it complicated his attack. The Soviets were fighting intelligently, using coordinated tactics rather than individual responses. Roll closed on one of the climbing La-5s, centered it in his gun sight, and fired a 3-second burst at 600 feet range. His shells hit, sparking along the Soviet fighter's fuselage and wing route. The La-5 rolled violently right, trailing smoke, but didn't fall. Instead, the pilot held his aircraft together, maintained control, and dove away towards Soviet lines. Roll couldn't follow. The other 3 La-5s from that element were closing, forcing him to maneuver defensively. What followed was 6 minutes of the most intense air combat Roll had experienced on the Eastern Front. The La-5s matched every German maneuver. When the FW-190s attempted to zoom climb to altitude, the Soviet fighters climbed with them. When the Germans dove away at high speed, the La-5s followed, maintaining pursuit longer than should have been possible given their documented performance limitations. Roll's group shot down 2 La-5s confirmed, with 3 more claimed as probables. But the Germans lost 1 FW-190 to a direct hit from Soviet cannon fire, and 2 more returned to base with significant damage. The exchange ratio, 2-to-1, would have been acceptable against well-flown British Spitfires over Western Europe. Against Soviet fighters that intelligence had classified as inferior, it was shocking. In the debriefing, Roll was direct. Those weren't the La-5s we fought 6 months ago. The engines performed well at altitude. The pilots knew what they were doing. We had no decisive advantage in any flight regime. If they had more experience, they would have shot down more of us. The intelligence officer showed Roll performance charts for the La-5 based on captured aircraft and pilot reports from early 1943. The charts showed a rapid decline in performance above 15,000 feet. Roll shook his head. Whatever those charts say, the aircraft we fought today didn't match them. Those fighters climbed above 20,000 feet without difficulty and maintained combat power at altitude. Either your data is wrong, or the Soviets have made significant improvements. The intelligence officer made a note, but offered no explanation. The truth was that German intelligence had no explanation. The systematic improvements to the La-5 throughout late 1942 and early 43 had occurred without German awareness. The Soviets, learning from catastrophic losses, had implemented changes across their entire aviation industry without providing any external indication of the scope of improvement. The technical intelligence gap was exacerbated by German strategic assumptions. The German High Command had believed that Soviet industry, evacuated east beyond the Urals in 1941 and operating in desperate conditions, couldn't possibly be improving aircraft design while simultaneously increasing production. It was one or the other. Either the Soviets could build lots of mediocre aircraft, or they could build small numbers of improved designs. The idea that they could do both simultaneously seemed to violate basic industrial logic. This assumption was wrong. Soviet aircraft factories, despite operating in Siberian winter conditions with inadequate facilities and overtaxed workers, had not only maintained production, but had systematically incorporated improvements into ongoing production runs. The La-5F wasn't a distinct model requiring new tooling and production lines. It was the existing La-5, with improved engines and detail modifications that could be implemented within existing manufacturing processes. Soviet engineers had learned a crucial lesson from German industrial practice. Continuous improvement was more effective than revolutionary redesign. Rather than developing entirely new aircraft, which would require years of development and new production facilities, they improved existing designs incrementally. Every production batch of La-5s incorporated minor improvements. Better quality control reduced variations between aircraft. Improved production techniques, reduced weight, and improved finish. Engine improvements increased power output without requiring complete redesign. By July 1943, the La-5 rolling off Soviet production lines was dramatically superior to the La-5 of mid-1942, but the improvements had been incremental enough that German intelligence, focused on identifying new aircraft types rather than evolutionary improvements, had missed the transformation entirely. The result was a gap between intelligence assessments and battlefield reality that German pilots were discovering at 20,000 feet over Kursk. The tactical implications became clear over the following days of the Kursk offensive. German fighters could no longer rely on altitude superiority to guarantee victory. Soviet fighters, particularly the La-5F, could contest control of the airspace at medium altitudes where most combat occurred. This forced German pilots to fight longer engagements, burning more fuel, expending more ammunition, and taking more risks to achieve victories that previously would have been straightforward. Hauptmann Walter Krupinski, an experienced pilot with 43 victories at the start of the Kursk operation, described the changed tactical situation in a letter to a fellow pilot. "We still have better aircraft and better pilots, but the margin has narrowed. 6 months ago, an encounter with La-5s at altitude meant easy victories. Now it means a fight, a real fight where mistakes cost you. The Soviets have learned, and their aircraft have improved. We can't ignore them anymore." The psychological impact on German pilots was subtle but significant. For 2 years, they had operated with the confidence that came from technological and tactical superiority. They had known that in any engagement, they had multiple options for disengaging if the situation became unfavorable. Altitude, speed, maneuverability all favored the German fighters in most circumstances. Now that confidence was shaken. The appearance of La-5 fighters at altitude meant commitment to combat. The German fighters couldn't simply zoom away to safety because the Soviet aircraft could follow them, could maintain pursuit, could sustain combat power at altitudes that should have been German sanctuaries. This psychological shift manifested in changed tactics. German formations started operating at higher altitudes, 25 to 28,000 feet, instead of 20 to 22,000. This restored some of their performance advantage, as even the improved La-5 struggled above 25,000 feet. But operating at higher altitudes meant longer times to intercept targets, higher fuel consumption, and less effective ground attack support. The tactical flexibility that had characterized German air operations was being constrained by the need to maintain altitude superiority. Soviet pilots, meanwhile, were discovering that their improved aircraft gave them capabilities their tactics hadn't yet fully exploited. The early La-5 had required defensive tactics focused on survival rather than aggressive engagement. Pilots learned to fight at low altitude where their aircraft performed best, to use turning fights where maneuverability mattered more than speed, to avoid prolonged combats at medium and high altitudes where performance deteriorated. The La-5F changed these tactical requirements. Pilots could now operate effectively, at altitudes up to 23,000 feet. They could engage German fighters in zoom climbs and diving attacks, tactics that previously had been suicidal. They could maintain sustained combat at medium altitudes without experiencing rapid performance degradation. The aircraft's capabilities had evolved faster than the tactical doctrine for using them. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Pokryshkin, the Soviet Union's second highest scoring ace with 59 victories, flew La-5 fighters during the Battle of Kursk and immediately recognized the tactical opportunities the improved performance provided. Pokryshkin had developed tactics called Kuban Cubs during combat over the Kuban region in early 1943. These tactics emphasized altitude advantage, surprise attacks, and coordinated formations. With the La-5F, Pokryshkin refined these tactics further. He positioned his formation at maximum altitude for the aircraft, typically 22 to 24,000 feet. From this altitude, he could spot German formations operating at similar or slightly higher altitudes. He would position his fighters up-sun, making them harder to spot against the glare. Then he would lead diving attacks from this altitude, building speed to 400 miles per hour or more, closing on German fighters before they could react, firing accurately at close range, then pulling up into a zoom climb that the La-5F could sustain. The tactic worked because it negated the German altitude advantage. German fighters operating at 25 to 26,000 feet still had performance advantage, but the margin was small enough that Soviet pilots willing to accept tactical risk could contest that altitude band. The psychological impact on German pilots who encountered Pokrishkin's formations was notable. They had been briefed that Soviet aircraft couldn't operate effectively above 20,000 feet, yet here were Soviet fighters, appearing at 23,000 feet, executing coordinated attacks with precision that rivaled German tactical standards. Throughout the Battle of Kursk, which lasted from July 5th through July 16th, 1943, German pilots filed hundreds of combat reports describing engagements with high-performing Soviet fighters at medium and high altitudes. The intelligence analysts attempted to categorize these reports, trying to determine if pilots were encountering a new Soviet aircraft type, modified versions of existing designs, or perhaps captured British or American fighters being operated by Soviet units. The truth was simpler, but harder to accept. The Soviets had improved their existing designs through systematic engineering work. They had identified the specific weaknesses that limited high-altitude performance and addressed them methodically. The boosted engines with improved superchargers, the aerodynamic refinements, the manufacturing quality improvements, these weren't revolutionary changes. They were the application of sound engineering principles to solve defined problems. German aviation experts who later examined captured La-5F aircraft were forced to acknowledge Soviet competence in ways that contradicted their preconceptions about Soviet industrial capabilities. The engine modifications were well executed, showing understanding of supercharger dynamics and high-altitude aerodynamics. The manufacturing quality, while not matching German standards, had improved significantly from earlier production. The overall design showed evidence of systematic development rather than crude copying or random modification. Major General Adolf Galland, receiving reports from the Eastern Front about the changed tactical situation, ordered a comprehensive intelligence review of Soviet aviation capabilities. The review, completed in August 1943, concluded that Soviet aircraft performance had improved across multiple types and that German tactical doctrine needed to be updated to reflect the reduced performance advantage German fighters enjoyed at medium altitudes. The report specifically noted the La-5 as demonstrating capabilities significantly exceeding earlier assessments. It recommended that German pilots treat the La-5 as a capable opponent at all altitudes below 25,000 feet and avoid prolonged turning engagements where the Soviet aircraft's tight turning radius provided advantage. The report's conclusions represented a fundamental shift in German assessment of Soviet aviation, acknowledging that the technical and tactical gap that had characterized the air war in 1941 and 42 had narrowed substantially. The industrial context behind this shift was equally significant. Soviet aviation factories, despite operating under difficult conditions, had achieved production rates that exceeded German capabilities. In 1943, Soviet factories produced approximately 35,000 combat aircraft. German production that same year was approximately 25,000 aircraft. The Soviets were producing more aircraft, and the quality gap was narrowing. This combination of quantity and improving quality created a strategic problem that Germany couldn't solve through tactical excellence alone. The La-5 production numbers were particularly striking. Between 1943 and 1944, Soviet factories produced approximately 10,000 La-5 fighters. Many of these were the improved F model with boosted engines. This scale of production meant that the improved aircraft weren't rare exceptions but were becoming standard equipment across Soviet fighter regiments. German pilots who had adapted their tactics based on encounters with a handful of high-performing Soviet fighters found themselves facing those capabilities more frequently as 1943 progressed. The human cost of this technical evolution was measured in the increasing casualties German fighter units sustained over the Eastern Front. In early 1943, a typical German fighter group might lose 2 or 3 pilots per month in combat, while claiming 30 or 40 Soviet aircraft destroyed. By late 1943, after the introduction of improved Soviet fighters and tactics, those same units were losing 5 or 6 pilots per month while claiming 20 to 25 Soviet aircraft. The exchange ratio was narrowing, and the trend was undeniable. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, whose encounter with high-altitude La-5s on July 5 had been among the first reported by German pilots, flew throughout the Battle of Kursk and witnessed the changed tactical environment firsthand. In a report written in August 1943, Stigler described the evolution. The air war over Russia has changed fundamentally. 6 months ago, encountering Soviet fighters meant near-certain victory for experienced pilots in modern aircraft. Today, it means combat where outcomes are uncertain. The Soviets have learned from defeat. Their aircraft have improved. Their tactics have become more sophisticated. Most importantly, they have numerical superiority and can afford losses that would cripple our units. Stigler's observation about numerical superiority highlighted a strategic reality that technical improvements amplified. Even when German aircraft maintained performance advantages, Soviet numerical superiority meant that German fighters were often outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1. When Soviet aircraft achieved near parity in performance, those numbers became decisive. A German formation of 8 fighters, engaging 12 Soviet fighters of roughly equal capability, faced mathematical disadvantage that skill and experience couldn't overcome indefinitely. The pilot quality gap, which had heavily favored Germany in 1941 and 42, was also narrowing. Soviet training programs, while still producing pilots with less flight time than their German counterparts, had improved significantly. By 1943, Soviet pilots arrived at combat units with approximately 150 to 200 hours of flight time. This was still less than the 300 to 400 hours typical for German pilots, but it was sufficient to execute basic combat tactics competently. More importantly, the Soviet pilots who survived their first 20 or 30 missions gained experience rapidly under the intense combat conditions of the Eastern Front. By mid-1943, Soviet fighter regiments included significant numbers of experienced pilots with 50, 100, or more missions. These pilots, flying improved aircraft and using refined tactics, were genuinely dangerous opponents. German pilots who had assumed that Soviet pilots would be inexperienced and poorly trained found themselves in combat with adversaries who demonstrated skill levels approaching their own. The technical superiority that La-5F demonstrated at medium altitudes also revealed a broader pattern in Soviet aviation development. The improvements weren't limited to a single aircraft type. The Yak-9 fighter, introduced in 1942, underwent similar incremental improvements throughout 1943. The Yak-3, introduced in 1944, would demonstrate performance capabilities that exceeded many German fighters across much of the flight envelope. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft received upgraded engines and improved armoring throughout its production run. Soviet aviation was learning and adapting faster than German intelligence had thought possible. The rigid bureaucratic systems and supposedly inferior engineering capabilities that German assessments had assumed would limit Soviet development simply weren't constraining improvement in the ways predicted. Instead, Soviet designers and engineers, working under enormous pressure with limited resources, were achieving incremental improvements that accumulated into significant capability increases. The fundamental lesson that German pilots learned over Kursk in July 1943 was that technological superiority was temporary and that assumptions about enemy capabilities could become dangerously obsolete. The La-5 fighters climbing to 20,000 feet and catching FW-190s represented more than just improved Soviet aircraft. They represented a changed strategic balance, where German advantages in training, equipment, and tactics were being systematically eroded by an enemy with superior numbers and rapidly improving capabilities. The shock of that realization, experienced by pilots like Franz Stigler, who watched Soviet fighters climb to altitudes they supposedly couldn't reach, marked a turning point in the air war over the Eastern Front. The certainty of German superiority, built on 2 years of overwhelming victories, had been replaced by the uncertainty of combat, where outcomes were no longer predetermined by nationality and aircraft type. The war in the air had become a real contest, and the Germans were discovering that in a contest decided by numbers and industrial capacity, they were on the losing side. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.